Have you ever stopped to wonder why the things we can't have seem so much more appealing than the ones within our reach? Why desire becomes more intense when there's a closed door, a barrier, a you can't? This becomes especially clear when we talk about our sexuality. What is forbidden, hidden, or considered inappropriate often triggers a curiosity and arousal that what is accepted and allowed simply can't match. And here's something few people admit. This is completely normal. It's part of human nature. There is nothing wrong with you for feeling this way. Carl Rogers, one of the most influential psychologists of the last century, dedicated his life to understanding the human heart deeply and without judgment. He knew that behind every desire, every impulse, there's a person trying to find themselves, trying to be authentic in a world that constantly tells us who we should be. When we talk about sexuality and desire, we're talking about one of the most intimate and vulnerable parts of being human. And Rogers taught us that it's precisely in that vulnerability where we find our greatest strength to grow and truly know ourselves. What you're about to discover in the next few minutes might completely change the way you see your own desires. Not to judge or suppress them, but to understand them as part of a greater journey toward who you really are. Because in the end, what we feel as forbidden often reveals much more about our internal prisons than it does about our true desires. Our mind has a fascinating trait. It gets excited by what is hard to reach. It's as if every barrier becomes an invitation for our imagination to work even harder. When something is forbidden, our mind creates an entire story around it. We fantasize about what it would be like, imagine scenarios, build expectations. And in that process, what is inaccessible takes on an aura of mystery and intensity that reality can rarely sustain. Carl Rogers understood that many of our internal conflicts are born from what he called conditions of worth. Rules we've learned about how we need to be in order to be accepted and loved. These rules create a painful split within us. There's what we should feel and what we actually feel. In sexuality, this split becomes even more evident. We grow up hearing that some desires are normal and others are abnormal, that some practices are right and others are wrong, that some fantasies are healthy while others are problematic. And here lies the paradox. The more something is labeled as forbidden, the more our mind fixates on it. It's as if it says, if this is so dangerous, it must be powerful. I need to understand what it's about. What Rogers taught us is that this division between the allowed and the forbidden doesn't come from within us. It's built. And because it's built, it can be questioned, understood, and, when necessary, rebuilt in a healthier, more authentic way. There's something curious that happens when we finally gain access to what was once forbidden. Often, it loses the intensity that once attracted us so strongly. This doesn't mean there's no pleasure or satisfaction. It means that part of the excitement was tied to the prohibition itself, not necessarily the experience. It's as if our mind had fallen in love more with the idea of transgression than with the thing itself. And when the transgression disappears, we discover that what remains can be very different from what we imagined. Carl Rogers observed that many people spend their whole lives chasing things they think they desire, only to find out those desires weren't truly theirs. They were borrowed, built from others' expectations, or even from a need to rebel against those expectations. In sexuality, this becomes especially clear. Sometimes what arouses us isn't the act itself, but the feeling of doing something we shouldn't be doing, or the thrill of being different from what others expect of us. But Rogers invited us to go deeper, to ask, beneath this urge to transgress, what am I really seeking? Freedom? Authenticity? Acceptance? The feeling that I can be myself without masks? Because so often what we interpret as sexual desire is, in truth, a thirst for emotional freedom, a longing to feel whole, accepted, and real. One of the most liberating discoveries we can make is realizing how many of our desires aren't truly ours. They've been shaped by the messages we've received since childhood about what is attractive, exciting, or desirable. We live in a culture that constantly bombards us with images and ideas about how our sexuality should be. And unconsciously, we end up internalizing these standards as if they were our own desires. Carl Rogers called this incongruence, the gap between who we truly are and who we think we're supposed to be. And this incongruence creates a quiet suffering that we carry without always understanding where it comes from. In sexuality, this can show up in many ways. Maybe you feel drawn to things that, deep down, don't make you feel good about yourself. Or maybe you suppress desires you consider inappropriate, even though they are completely healthy and natural. Rogers believed that each person has an inner wisdom, a knowing that understands exactly what is good for them. But that wisdom gets muffled by the external voices telling us how we should be. The first step to discovering your true desires is having the courage to ask, is what I'm feeling really mine? Or is it something I've learned I should feel? And that question can be frightening, because questioning our desires means questioning parts of ourselves we thought we knew well. But it's also the path to a kind of freedom you may have never experienced before. There's something Rogers often observed. Many people fear real intimacy more than they fear sex itself. True intimacy demands something far scarier than any act of transgression. It asks us to be fully ourselves in front of another person. No masks, no performances, no trying to be who we think the other wants us to be. And maybe that's why we sometimes feel more aroused by encounters that maintain some emotional distance. Not because they're better, but because they feel safer. We don't have to risk showing who we really are. The forbidden often attracts us because it allows us to experience intensity without vulnerability. We can feel excitement without truly opening up. We can enjoy pleasure without risking rejection for who we genuinely are. But Rogers reminded us that this kind of safety comes at a cost. It keeps us from experiencing the deep connection our heart truly longs for. Because in the end, what we crave most isn't transgression. It's acceptance. Not prohibition, but the freedom to be authentic. Not emotional distance, but the courage to let ourselves be loved exactly as we are. And when we find that courage, we discover that true intimacy can be far more thrilling than any forbidden act. Because it offers something no transgression ever could, the chance to be fully ourselves and still be loved. So how can you find your true desires amid all the noise of external messages, prohibitions, and expectations? Carl Rogers taught that the answer lies in developing what he called internal listening, the ability to tune in to what truly resonates with who you are, not with who you think you're supposed to be. Start by asking yourself, when do I feel most authentic and true to myself? When do I feel most connected to who I am? Then notice whether those moments differ from the times when you feel drawn to what's forbidden. Often, we find that our most authentic desires are much simpler and more natural than we imagined. They don't need drama, prohibition, or rebellion to exist. They exist because they're part of who we are. Rogers believed that when we stop fighting ourselves, when we stop judging, something beautiful happens. We begin to trust our own inner wisdom. And that wisdom gently guides us toward what is truly good for us. This doesn't mean that every desire we have is healthy or that we should act on all of them. It means we can look at them with curiosity and compassion, rather than judgment and repression. Because when we fully accept ourselves, including our desires, fantasies, and curiosities, we paradoxically gain more freedom to choose how we want to live. Acceptance doesn't make us slaves to our impulses, it makes us free to consciously decide how we want to relate to them. There's a feeling Carl Rogers described as coming home to yourself. It's that deep sense of relief we feel when we finally stop fighting who we are and begin to accept ourselves. In sexuality, this might mean letting go of the search for excitement in things that, deep down, don't make us feel good about ourselves. It might mean having the courage to explore what truly attracts us, even if it's different from what we once believed should attract us. It might mean realizing that what excites us most isn't the forbidden, but the freedom to be authentic. Not the transgression, but the real connection. Not what we can't have, but the courage to receive what we truly want. Rogers taught that every person has a natural tendency to grow, to develop, to become more authentic. But that tendency can only flourish in an environment of acceptance and understanding. And the most important environment is the one we create within ourselves. When we stop judging, stop criticizing, and begin treating ourselves with the same compassion we'd offer a dear friend, something extraordinary happens. We begin to trust ourselves. We start to see that we can handle our desires in a mature and healthy way. We begin to understand that we don't need anyone else's approval to be who we are. And in that freedom, we discover that what we truly desire isn't so frightening after all. In fact, it's much simpler and more beautiful than we ever imagined. In the end, what Rogers taught us about desire and freedom can be summed up in a simple but revolutionary idea. You don't need anyone's permission to be who you are. That includes your desires, your fantasies, your curiosities. You don't need them to be approved by anyone. You don't need them to fit into any standard. All you need is your own compassion and understanding. When you give yourself that freedom, something interesting happens. You stop being drawn to what's forbidden just because it's forbidden. You start being drawn to what truly resonates with who you are. And we discover that this authentic attraction is far more satisfying than any transgression, because it comes from a place of truth, not rebellion. It comes from a place of self-love, not self-punishment. Rogers believed that when a person fully accepts themselves, they naturally make choices that are good for themselves and for others, not because they followed rules, but because they acted from their own inner wisdom. If you're reading this and seeing yourself in these words, know that you're not alone. Millions of people carry the same confusion, the same longing, the same thirst for authenticity. And know this too, it is possible to make peace with your desires. It is possible to discover what you truly want. It is possible to live a sexuality that is both pleasurable and authentic. The path might not always be easy, but it is simple. Start by treating yourself with compassion. Start by listening to yourself without judgment. Start by trusting that you already have the inner wisdom to navigate this intimate part of who you are. Because you do, and you always have. If these reflections stirred something in you, if you recognized yourself in any of these words, I invite you to do something. Leave a comment sharing how this perspective resonates with your own experience. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to feel less alone. Like this video if it helped you see your desires with more compassion. Share it with someone you know who's facing similar questions. And subscribe to the channel for more content that helps you know yourself better and accept yourself more deeply. Remember, you don't have to carry these questions alone. There is wisdom, there is acceptance, and there is a way back home to yourself. Until the next video, and thank you for having the courage to know yourself better.